Hello, I'm Floyd Stokes, your instructor for AJ3, Introduction to Corrections at College of the Redwoods. These series of PowerPoint videos are meant to give you an audio-visual overview of each chapter of the text, but you will still need to thoroughly read each chapter. Today I want to discuss Chapter 1 of our text, which is titled An Evidence-Based Approach to Corrections. This chapter has 5 learning objectives. 1. Describe how corrections is part of the larger criminal justice system and how decisions made along the way contribute to case dismissals, convictions, and potential disparity. 2. Compare and contrast both diversion and post-sentencing options and institutional and community-based corrections. 3. Explain the key reasons for the rise in incarceration rates since the 1980s and the overall effect that it has had on individuals, communities, and the crime rate. 4. Analyze the relationship among mass media, public opinion, and the making of correctional policy. And 5. Characterize the meaning of evidence-based practices and why it is significant to improving the correctional system. Well, let's get started. The criminal justice system consists of 3 components: police, courts, and corrections. Corrections is an integral part of the system that follows the court process after a defendant has been found guilty, or that aids the court during the process prior to the sentence. The process starts when the victim or witness reports a crime to the police, or when the police observe a crime taking place, or when the police proactively investigate criminal activity, such as setting up a sting operation to recover stolen property or to catch drug dealers. If the investigation of the crime results in an arrest and incarceration of a criminal suspect, corrections becomes involved. If the suspect is prosecuted, the courts become involved, and the suspect becomes a defendant. If the defendant is convicted during the court process, either through a plea bargain or a trial, corrections again becomes involved. Figure 1.1 on page 2 of the text shows a flowchart of the criminal justice system. It's pretty complex, but take some time to study it. Entry into the system is shown on the left in light blue. The prosecution and pretrial services phase is shown in purple. The court or adjudication phase is shown in dark pink, the sentencing and sanctions phase is shown in orange, and the corrections phase is shown in yellow. Certain key terms are shown on page 3. Let's look at them. Corrections is the network of government and private agencies responsible for the pre- and post-conviction custody, supervision, and treatment of persons accused or convicted of crimes. Police are law enforcement officials who are sworn to uphold the law, to keep social order, and to preserve public safety. The term police covers the myriad of law enforcement agencies, including police departments, sheriff's departments, and state and federal agencies. A citation is a police-issued ticket ordering a citizen to pay a fine for a minor law violation. Booked is when a suspect is identified and fingerprinted in jail after being arrested for an alleged crime. Jurisdiction is a predefined geographic area such as a city, a county, or a state. Dismissed is when a case is dropped for lack of evidence and does not proceed any further. Pretrial supervision is the community supervision of a defendant who has not yet been convicted, but who is waiting for his or her next court hearing date. The police are the gatekeepers of the entire criminal justice system. Their role is to enforce laws, preserve public safety, and keep social order. Their burden of proof in a criminal arrest is probable cause, or reasonable cause to believe that a crime was committed and the arrested person is the one who committed the crime. The prosecutors, called district attorneys or deputy district attorneys in this state, are involved in the court process with a higher burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Prosecutors have four major decision points in the handling of cases brought to them by the police. They initially screen the case to determine if it is strong enough to prove beyond a reasonable doubt in court. Dismissal or rejection of the case may occur if evidence is weak or inadequately linked to the defendant. Prosecutors will go forward with charging the case through the filing of either an information or a grand jury indictment to the court if they believe there is enough evidence to hold the defendant accountable for the crime. During the court process, they may offer or consider a plea deal with the defendant through his or her attorney, depending on the strength of the case. The fourth decision point is the case disposition. At any point in the court process, right up to the end of the trial, prosecutors may settle the case through a plea bargain with the defendant through his or her attorney. Very few cases actually make it to trial. If the case does make it to trial and the trial results in a conviction, the prosecutor will be involved in presenting sentencing disposition recommendations. The defendant may be held in jail or may be released on pretrial supervision at any point in the process. Let's look at the various corrections options that are available to offenders. I'll start with the definitions of these key terms: diversion, continuum of sanctions, community corrections, net widening, and institutional corrections. Pretrial diversion is essentially a suspension of the criminal process or the criminal justice process for individuals who have not been formally sentenced, but who agree to complete stipulations such as community service or treatment in exchange for having their charges dropped with no formal record of conviction at the end of a period of time, for example, 1 year. If the offender on diversion supervision does not comply with the conditions, a formal execution of the sentence ensues and a record of the conviction remains. Diversion is usually for misdemeanor or first-time felony offenders. Continuum of sanctions is a term that means the use of one or more sentencing options within the community or an institution that may be combined with one another to achieve more than one or a range of sentencing goals. Community corrections means court-ordered supervision and treatment while allowing the offender to remain in the community. The philosophy behind this concept is that the offender does not pose a threat to public safety and thus does not need to be incarcerated. Community corrections include such programs as probation, restitution, electronic monitoring, or day reporting centers. However, these programs depend on community resources. Net widening occurs when offenders receive a level of correctional control or punishment that is greater than what they really require, resulting in bringing more people into the system. Institutional corrections is the incarceration of offenders in a jail or prison, apart or away from the community. For nonviolent felony offenses, community-based supervision may be an option. However, for predatory felony cases and crimes of violence, the focus may be on public safety. The philosophy behind institutional corrections is that some people need to be separated from elements of daily life to protect others' safety or pay for crime by taking away their freedom. In the past, prisons were long-term felony offender institutions, and jails primarily housed misdemeanants and pretrial detainees. However, because of California's federally mandated prison realignment plan, county jails are experiencing an influx of felony inmates. In any event, it is estimated that about 95% of incarcerated persons will be released someday. Despite recent declines in the use of prison, the U.S. incarceration rate of men and women remains the highest in the world, surpassing all other countries. Two key terms should be considered: incarceration rate and economic mobility. Let's take a look at these. Incarceration rate is defined as the proportion of people in jail and prison per 100,000 residents in a given area. Another key term is economic mobility, which is the likelihood at which individuals can rise and maintain a higher socioeconomic status than they were born into through employment and earnings. The correction system, especially incarceration, hinders the economic mobility of individuals and their children, and thus hinders their ability to move up the economic ladder. In order to understand the key reasons for the rise in incarceration rates since the 1980s, a look at the 20th century history of American prisons is in order. By the 1950s, the rhetoric of reform began to emerge in our prisons. Gradually, prisons began to offer more privileges and develop more liberal policies. During this period, prisons began to be called correctional institutions, and rehabilitation programs began to be implemented. However, promises of reforms did not necessarily translate into realities for most prisoners, and prisons erupted into riots, first in the 1950s, and then 20 years later in the 1970s. The 1970s was a time of great change for prisons. The unrest on the streets seeped into prisons and led to prisoners demanding more rights. Race conflict emerged and often escalated into violence. Also, this decade saw the emergence of the scourge of drugs in this country. By the mid-1980s, from the federal government to local levels, policies of get tough on crime and the war on drugs emerged, and incarceration rates soared. The correctional institutions' rhetoric of reform gave way fairly quickly to the warehouse prisons of today, and the disparity of treatment between Caucasians and people of color, from arrest to incarceration, continues to be an issue today. Women inmates also have been adversely affected by the get tough policies of modern prisons. Let's analyze the relationship among mass media, public opinion, and the making of correctional policies. Three key terms are discussed in the text. The mass media provides us with global news, entertainment, and education, and has perhaps the greatest influence in how most people learn and develop opinions about various social issues. Public opinion on crime and punishment issues remains deeply rooted in television programs depicting crime scene investigations, courtroom dramas, and scenes of the agitated, difficult prisoner. News programs and newspapers remain wedded to headlining only the most horrific crimes that have occurred that particular day, while at the same time ignoring more common crimes. This creates a public perception that violence is random and frequent, while ignoring the true likelihood of victimization of violence and its contributing factors. Research on media influence and crime indicates support for the cultivation theory, otherwise known as the, quote, mean world syndrome, unquote. Cultivation theory suggests that violence in the media by itself does not cause individuals to become violent. Rather, repeated and cumulative exposure to violence eventually creates a sense of insecurity and irrational fear of violent victimization and anxiety about certain types of people in the world in general. The text says this leads to a potential for widespread moral panic about child abductions, child molestations, and homicides. And I have to agree. All this media hype about crime makes me nervous. And what about the recent school shootings and gun control. What do you think? Media influences and public opinion are also related in part to the formation of crime control policy. Throughout the book, you will consider philosophies, practices, and procedures that are being used to implement crime control policy. Many of these policies were developed in piecemeal fashion by state and federal legislatures for responses to an immediate problem or in reaction to something other states are doing. Sort of a knee-jerk reaction, right? Crime policies in the United States appear to be distinctly different, more punitive than crime policies in other Western countries in the world. More punitive crime policies have led to responses that have relied substantially on incarceration. This has caused correctional spending to increase faster than most other government budget items. Correctional spending is about the fourth largest line item now in most states' budgets after education, healthcare, and transportation. Annual corrections costs account for over $173 billion at state and local levels. Despite increasing corrections expenditures, recidivism rates remains high, with about half of all persons released from prison returning within 3 years. To complicate the problem, offenders cycle in and out of the justice system from the same communities that are also underserved and impoverished. In order to characterize the meaning of evidence-based practices and its significance, we should discuss a few key terms. In 2006, the Bureau of Justice Assistance started the Justice Reinvestment Initiative to address concerns over the high cost of corrections. In 2010, a national summit was held, and the BJA was joined by nonprofit organizations such as the Pew Center on the States and others. The report that was released concluded that incarceration is a very high cost response with very low positive returns on the investment. Included in its recommendations were that correctional programs become more cost-effective by using objective assessments to separate the offenders who pose the greatest risk to public safety from those who should be in community correction programs that work. The term Justice Reinvestment Initiative defines a data-driven approach to encourage states to reduce correctional spending and reinvest savings in strategies designed to prevent crime. States and localities collect and analyze data on factors related to prison population, growth, and costs, implement changes to increase efficiencies, and measure both the fiscal and public safety impacts of those changes with technical and financial assistance in the form of grants. The four-step Justice Reinvestment Initiative process is to analyze trends, to understand factors driving jail and prison population growth, to develop and implement policy options to generate savings based on sustainable, evidence-based approaches, to reinvest the money saved back into high-risk communities and other prevention-oriented strategies, and to measure the impact of policy changes and reinvestment resources. At about the same time as the Justice Reinvestment Initiative began, the term Evidence-Based Practices, or EBP as it is known, also surfaced on the criminal justice scene. EBP is used in fields other than corrections, such as medicine, education, social work, and mental health. EBP allows academics and practitioners to come together with programs that work and make a difference on intended outcomes. In corrections, evidence-based practices include correctional interventions for which there is consistent and solid scientific evidence showing that they work to meet the intended outcomes, such as recidivism reduction and risk and needs assessment. We're going to talk more about this throughout the course. EBP challenges anecdotal evidence by requiring programs to prove with statistical evidence that what they do works. Evidence-based practices as they relate to corrections are discussed in detail on pages 8, 9, 10, and 11. You want to for sure read these. On page 10, the text lists two key terms related to evidence-based practices: social learning and cognitive behavioral approaches. Social learning is the concept that modeling new skills and desirable behavior changes old behavior. Cognitive behavioral approaches consist of change to thinking patterns and habits that lead to criminal behavior, such as self-control, anger management, social perspective taking, moral reasoning, problem solving, and attitudinal change. To summarize this chapter, corrections is an important component of the criminal justice system. Decisions by police and prosecutors impact a person through the process. Options for those charged with crime include diversionary programs as well as community and institutional-based programs. The war on drugs and other get-tough legislation has increased incarceration rates and limited economic mobility. Media impacts not only the opinions of crime, but also plays a role in shaping policy and relations between criminal justice and the community. Evidence-based practices have brought a new level of accountability to corrections. Well, that's it for now. We'll see you in class.